Good evening, and welcome to tonight's online installment of Kansas City Public Library's signature event series. I'm Katie Stover, Director of Reader Services, and the library is excited to once again be a part of Kansas City's celebration of Women's Equality Week and the continued commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment with tonight's program, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, featuring author Dr. Kimberly Hamlin. If you haven't yet, please consider visiting the library's 19th Amendment website, and please check the chat box on the right side of your screen for the link. On that page, you will find the Coloring Kansas City 19th Amendment coloring book, and copies are available at all Kansas City Public Library locations, and the pages may also be downloaded. That link is also posted in the chat. Last week, the library hosted Dr. Sage Matthew discussing African American women's suffrage. You can view the recording of that event on the library's YouTube channel, where you are right now, but please wait until after tonight's event. We hope to see you back here on Saturday at 10 a.m. for Strictly Speaking, Equal Rights Should Have No Deadline. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Free Thinker, you can help support local independent bookstores by ordering from bookshop.org. You can choose to support a local bookstore, or the profits go into a pool that is evenly distributed among independent bookstores. And tonight, Kimberly and I hope that you target two of her favorite independent bookstores where you could get signed copies of Free Thinker. And those are Interabang Books in Dallas, Texas, or Joseph Beth Books in Cincinnati, Ohio. Learn more and order a copy of Free Thinker at bookshop.org. And now, please welcome Stacy Webb to introduce Dr. Kimberly Hamlin. Stacy is the Director of Education for the League of Women Voters of Kansas City Board. The League is a charter member of the Women's Equality Coalition, which was created several years ago by Alice Kitchen and Gail James. Last year, they placed the stewardship in the hands of Kate Heinen and Stacy. Stacy?
Thanks, Katie. The Women's Equality Coalition members are organizations that enhance the lives of women throughout Greater Kansas City. The coalition focuses on amplifying free public events that focus on voting rights, pay equity, and anti-violence. We cherish our partnership with such an esteemed library. Each year near the Women's Equality Day, we get to co-present an author event with the library. This year is even more special as we celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Kimberly Hamlin is an award-winning historian, author, professor, specializing in the history of women, gender, sex in the United States. A graduate of Georgetown and the University of Texas in Austin, Kimberly has written on the origins of the Miss America pageant, the history of Girl Scouts, bearded ladies, women running for president, Darwin in America, and the Equal Rights Amendment. She joins us tonight to discuss her most recent book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. Kimberly?
Thank you. Thank you so much to Katie and to Steve and everyone at the Kansas City Public Library for inviting me here tonight, first in person and now virtually. And thank you so much, Stacy, for that wonderful introduction. You know, I often say that if you want to have your faith in humanity restored, go to a League of Women Voters meeting, or better yet, join the League of Women Voters. So I hope that we can talk more about that at the end. And you know, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, where we like to think that we have the very best public library system in America, but Kansas City, boy, you are really giving us a run for your money. I've long heard about your author events, and I'm so honored to be doing one tonight. And I've been so impressed with all the Suffrage Centennial resources on your website, a coloring book. It's awesome. I printed it out for my kids. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to mark Women's Equality Day with you all. And thanks to everyone who's joining us on YouTube. I look forward to your questions and comments at the end. I want to start by asking a few questions of my own tonight. What does Women's Equality Day commemorate? What does it mean to be equal, and which women are we talking about? Moreover, as a nation, whose stories do we tell? What stories do we tell about ourselves in our textbooks, in our museums, in our monuments? Whose names do we remember and whose names do we forget? Technically, Women's Equality Day marks the day that Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby signed the newly ratified 19th Amendment into law, removing the word sex as a legal basis by which states could deny citizens the vote. But just who was enfranchised by the 19th Amendment and who was not? To help us think through these questions, tonight I'm going to introduce you to a woman named Helen Hamilton Gardner, a woman who is perhaps the most interesting and important suffragist that no one has ever heard of. And if you pause for a second, I'm going to pull up my screen to share some images with you. HHG, as I call her, is going to be our guide tonight. And with her as our guide, we're going to focus on three themes that I hope will help us come to a better understanding of Women's Equality Day, what it means, and what it might mean. These three themes are sex. I wanted to go ahead and start with that one first. I hope it's okay that we talk about sex here at the Kansas City Public Library before anyone sneaks out to get a snack or takes a nap. We're going to be talking about sex and specifically how the sexual double standard motivated women to demand the vote. Our second theme tonight is going to be race, and more specifically, how racism shaped the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. And our final theme tonight is going to be historical memory, how our collective amnesia regarding women's contributions to American history hinders women's equality today. Who was Helen Hamilton Gardner? Helen Hamilton Gardner was the fallen woman, meaning a woman who had sex outside of marriage. In her case, she had sex before marriage. She had an affair when she was in her early 20s, and she was outed in the newspapers for it. She was a fallen woman who, rather than slink away in shame, she reinvented herself. She changed her name. She moved to New York City and became one of the best known speakers and reformers of the 19th century. In the early 1900s, she reinvented once more. She married a Civil War hero, moved to Washington, D.C., and became the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington. Her colleagues in the National American Woman Suffrage Association called her the most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. She played such a vital role that President Woodrow Wilson selected her among all the women he knew, among all the suffragists he had worked with, for a high-profile position. He appointed her to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, making her the highest-ranking woman to date at that time in federal government, and a national symbol of what it finally meant for women, or at least white women, to be full citizens. And we, for the most part, have never heard of her. So that's another theme of our talk tonight. Helen Hamilton Gardner was born Alice Chenoweth. This is her on the left when she was about 2 with her older sister. She was born in Winchester, Virginia, as the youngest of 7 children, born to a slave-owning Methodist minister and his wife. And her father, Reverend Alfred Griffith Chenoweth, struggled for years with the slaves he had inherited from his family and his wife's family, and the inherent contradictions to him as a Methodist minister. So when young Alice was just 1, Reverend Chenoweth moved the family and all the people they held in bondage to Washington, D.C., so that he could emancipate those people. And then he moved his family to Indiana so that he could raise his family, he hoped, without the taint of slavery, and he hoped also to avoid the coming Civil War. But that was not to be. President Lincoln called upon the former circuit riding minister of Virginia to serve as a Union scout. So here we have a Virginia first family, a Virginia patriarch, taking up arms for the Union, guiding Union soldiers throughout his birthlands of Virginia. Alice Chenoweth's 3 older brothers also all took up arms, fought, and eventually died prematurely from their Civil War wounds for the Union. This is a key moment in young Alice's life. She also ends up living in Missouri for a few years. After her family loses basically everything in the Civil War, they move to St. Charles County, to Dardenne, Missouri, and she lives there from 1865 until 1872. From there, She had watched her mother struggle in probate courts because after her father died, her mom had no rights, like all 19th century women, no rights to the children she had born over from her own body, no rights to her property. And she had watched her older sisters and sisters-in-law bear and bury babies and ultimately die themselves. Her sister in this picture died in childbirth when she was just 23. So young Alice said, that life is not for me. So she moved to Cincinnati, where I live, and she attended the Cincinnati Normal School, which was what teacher training schools were called. This was basically the only acceptable job for a middle-class white woman in the mid-19th century. So Alice Chenoweth wanted to become a self-supporting teacher. And that's just what she did. She excelled in her profession. By the age of 22, she was living in Sandusky, Ohio, and she was the youngest school principal in Ohio history. She was so proud of this accomplishment for the rest of her life. She included it in all of her biographies. She wrote about it. She had managed to become self-supporting and a successful career woman. And now we're getting to the sex, in case you were wondering where the sex part of our story is. It is now. So as you can see, she's young and she's beautiful. Her skills in the classroom and her beauty drew her to the attention of the elected Ohio Commissioner of Public Schools, a man named Charles Smart, who also happened to be a married father of two. It was Charles Smart's job to travel all over the state of Ohio, checking on the state's schools. So her neighbors in Sandusky, this is the house she lived in, her neighbors in Sandusky began to wonder, why is Commissioner Smart constantly in our town? We are not the capital of Ohio. We don't have the biggest school system. We don't have the best school system. And now young Alice Chenoweth has the misfortune to board in this house with the brother and sister-in-law of the publisher of the daily paper. So you can see where this story is going. Soon, the rumors of Alice's affair with Charles Smart, the real reasons why Commissioner Smart is constantly in Sandusky, make it into the newspaper, not just in Sandusky, but all throughout the state of Ohio. Some newspapers even print her name, as you can see here in the highlighted section. Now, Alice Chenoweth is a fallen woman. She's forced to resign her hard-earned position. She's run out of town. And this is the event that really, starts her life. Most women in the 19th century, this would be the end of the story. Most 19th century fiction, as you may know, features the sad stories of fallen women who go on to lead miserable lives and die horrible deaths, right? But something in young Alice Chenoweth, I think perhaps her father's bravery in the Civil War, I think perhaps the bravery of her oldest brother, Bernard Chenoweth, who moved in 1859 to the Kansas-Missouri border so that he could publish a free soil newspaper there. I think their iconoclasm, being born in Virginia and taking up arms for the Union, I think something about these stories inspired her. And she said, not today. I am not going to slink away in shame. So instead, she begins thinking and wondering, especially about the sexual double standard. She wonders, why is she fired? Why does Charles Smart get to keep his job and his family? He had lied to her and told her she was divorced, but no one cared about that, right? They only cared that she had dared to have sex outside of marriage. So you can see here, she went on to wonder about this for years. Why is virginity considered a woman's most valuable asset when no one expects or even cares if a man is a virgin? So the sexual double standard motivates her entry into public life. After several years of reading and thinking and reflecting on her experiences, trying to make sense of them, Alice Chenoweth moves to New York City and makes her public debut as Helen Hamilton Gardner. Now, it's important to remember this is in the 1880s, where you could change your name and move to a new city and no one would know about your previous scandal because they couldn't Google you. So Helen Hamilton Gardner distances herself from her affair. She continues, as we'll see, arguing for, lobbying for, reforming for the sake of fallen women without ever admitting that she too is a fallen woman. So in 1884, she makes her debut on the lecture circuit, and in particular on the free thought lecture circuit, which is what we today would call atheist or agnostic, because she's come to believe in all of her questioning and all of her reading that the Bible and the churches that promote its messages is the root cause of women's degradation. She thinks that's where we get the idea of the sexual double standard. And that's where we get the idea that women are naturally inferior to men. And that's where we get the idea that, women should not be able to own property or be equal to their husbands in marriage. So she decides that if a man named Robert Ingersoll, who was the most popular speaker on the lecture circuit of the 19th century, if Robert Ingersoll could draw crowds of 10,000 or more with his messages and questions about the Bible, why couldn't she? So she befriends Robert Ingersoll. He introduces her first lecture, which guarantees her audiences and press coverage that no first-time speaker, especially a woman who nobody had ever heard of before, could expect. And so from there, her career, her public life, she's off and running from her very first lecture tour, which was called Men, Women, and Gods. And I would just want to read you something to show you her wit, her charm, her charisma, and her boldness. So she was very dismayed that many of the news stories about her lecture tour didn't really say anything about her words. They only commented on her looks, on her hair, on what she wore. This is a familiar story to us today, right? If for anyone who has read any news coverage of any female politician. But for Gardner, it was a new thing to be a public woman in the 19th century. So I want to read you what she had to say about this. She frequently wrote for a magazine called The Truth Seeker, which is still in print. It's the nation's longest running free thought periodical. And she didn't write to complain about the press coverage of her talk. She wrote a spoof, and her spoof is called Lecture by the New Male Star. And here's what she writes. At exactly 8 o'clock, Mr. Newman stepped upon the stage. He is a small man with large, luminous brown eyes and fair complexion. He wore his hair cut short and parted on the left side, about 1/8 of an inch from the middle. It looked as though it could use a good brush and had received some attention from a first-class barber from time to time. His collar, which was linen in the usual style, stood firm and close about a shapely throat, and a small white necktie told where it joined the shirt. Mr. Newman wore a shield bosom shirt with 3 small diamonds glistening upon its snowy surface, and another gem gleamed from the 3rd finger of his shapely left hand. His cuff buttons were of the most correct style, and his cuffs, which were of white linen, were visible below the cuff of an evening coat of black broadcloth. His coat was lined with black satin and hung upon him gracefully. From beneath his trousers peeped the daintiest feet, encased in patent leather shoes. Those who had the good fortune to meet the brilliant little man say that he had an overcoat and hat of the most correct style. But this we did not see, and so we can only vouch for the real literary feast we have reported above. His necktie buckled at the back. The end. So this is her skill throughout her life. She uses her wit, she uses her charisma to advocate for unpopular causes, for radical causes, and to get powerful leaders, especially men, to her side. After her successful lecture tour, she goes on to become one of the most sought after speakers and writers of the 19th century. Just to give you one small example, this is a picture of the Women's Building at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, where millions of Americans, 40% of the American population, traveled to visit. Gardner gave more speeches there than any other American woman. Crowds were said to have flocked to her talks, so much so that there were lines out the door. And at one event, the newspapers reported that people were trying to bribe the police officers guarding the doors to let them in. The New York Sun reported that next to Susan B. Anthony, Helen Hamilton Gardner created the profoundest sensation. But she wants to delve in a little bit deeper and find a signature cause. And she's frustrated by the limits of nonfiction, by essay writing, because she wants to talk about sex and the sexual double standard. So she turns to fiction in the 1890s because she wants to enhance the public's appreciation of what women's lives are like, of what this limited choices women and girls have in terms of romance, sex, and marriage. So her first two novels aim to give the perspective of the fallen woman, not of the sad story of her life, but of her limited choices and the things that she's expected to endure without saying anything. For these two novels, she became known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women. From here, she turns her attention to what became her signature cause of the 19th century, and that's raising the age of sexual consent for girls. I had an article published yesterday in Smithsonian magazine if you want to read a little bit more about this, but just in brief, I want you to fasten your seatbelts and hold on to your hats for a second, because I think this will come as a surprise. In 1890, the age of sexual consent for girls, meaning the age at which the courts determined girls could legally consent to sex with grown men, in 1890, the age of sexual consent for girls was 12 or younger in 38 states. In Delaware, it was 7. Gardner has come to believe that this one cause sort of stands in for all the terrible ramifications of the sexual double standard. So she joins forces with the leaders of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, who are leading the charge to raise the age of sexual consent. Even though Gardner is not a Christian and she does not even support temperance, she joins forces with them to raise the age of sexual consent. She does this through her magazine called The Arena. That's what this picture is from. It was a reformist magazine that Gardner edited in the 1890s, and she turned it into a single issue publication with the aim of raising the age of sexual consent for girls, which they succeeded in doing to age 14 or 16 in dozens of states by 1895. And the reason the Women's Christian Temperance Union really took the lead on this is, as Frances Willard, the group's longtime president, explained, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink and the degradation of women. So they thought that by eradicating one, they might eradicate the other. But I want to point out here that the women, including Gardner, were so surprised by how hard it was to change these age of consent laws. Gardner published roll calls, tallies. She lobbied state by state by state. She encouraged her readers to contact all 9,000 state legislators in the US. The women were rebuffed. If they ended up getting a law proposed in a state legislature, it often included mocking or nullifying language, such like words that said that the girls had to be able to prove they were virgins at the time of the attack, or that the girls could only be, that the law would only pertain to white girls. So Gardner and her colleagues were really floored by this intransigence, and this really motivated the 200,000 temperance women to become ardent suffragists. In these campaigns is where Gardner learns politics. This is where she learns lobbying. This is where she learns how legislative change happens. These are the lessons that she's soon going to apply to the vote. And I just want to give you a quick example here that really exemplified for these women what it would mean when women could vote, and especially when women could hold office. So in 1893, Colorado enfranchised women. The very next year, 3 women were elected to the Colorado state legislature, including Carrie Hawley, who you see here. So Carrie Hawley has the distinction of introducing the very first bill ever introduced by a woman in the United States legislature. Can you guess what this bill was? I know you can, because I've already pretty much highlighted it for you. Hawley's bill was to raise the age of sexual consent. Her bill wanted the law to pertain to both boys and girls, but the legislature watered it down and it pertained only to girls. But she did succeed in raising the age of consent to 18. The only other states where women succeeded in raising the age of consent to 18 were Wyoming and Kansas, 2 of the states where women had at least partial franchise. So for women reformers, the lessons were clear. If we want to have control over our bodies, over what happens to our bodies and our daughters' bodies, we need the vote and we need to hold office. So that's the sex part of our story. Now we're going to turn to theme 2, race and racism. In 1902, Gardner suffers a breakdown. Her lover, Charles Smart, the man she had had the affair with, she went on to live with him for 25 years, and she told everyone that they were married, but they totally were not married. When he dies, she finds a letter in his deathbed pocket from his daughter indicating that he had kept up relations with his family the entire time. Soon after, his wife, Lavinia, comes to New York City and claims, priority in the probate, threatening to ruin Gardner's hard-earned reputation. So Gardner goes to Puerto Rico to visit this guy, Colonel Selden Allen Day. They soon marry. They travel the world for many years. When they return, they live in Washington, D.C. They settle at this lovely home at 1838 Lamont Street. And here is when Gardner joins the suffrage movement. Before, she had not been a member of any suffrage group. She was best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton because they had met on the Free Thought lecture circuit, but she had not joined any suffrage groups because she was a little too radical for suffrage in the 19th century. But when she moves to DC, she lives next door to, are you ready? James Beauchamp Clark, who you may know as the longtime Speaker of the House from Missouri. So Gardner uses her signature charm, she uses her charisma, she uses her humor to enlist the support of the Speaker of the House. She also draws on her husband's address book. Colonel Day had been a Civil War hero. He fought for the Union, but one of his jobs was guarding the cell of Confederate President Jefferson Davis at Fort Monroe. And Jefferson Davis's widow had written in her memoirs about how kind Day was to her husband. So this endeared him to Confederates as well as Unionists. Why is this important? Why should we care? Because who's in charge in Washington in the 1910s while the suffragists are trying to get the 19th Amendment through Congress? Well, it's Civil War veterans, their sons and nephews. So Gardner's husband's address book is chock full with these contacts, and that's who Gardner works with. She uses her Civil War ties and connections. She befriends their wives. She befriends their daughters to become the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington. Her first big task for suffrage is to work with Alice Paul, pictured here with Gardner in 1913, to plan the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade designed to coincide with the first inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. The women worked side by side, night and day, in the makeshift Nassau office. That was the suffrage group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Gardner was in charge of securing all the permits for the parade, and she was the press committee chair. Alice Paul boasted that Gardner had done such a fantastic job. This was the very first time that women's suffrage had received positive national media attention. So Gardner was a real whiz at publicity. And you can see here how many people attended the parade and blocked eventually the path of the 5,000 women who had marched. But I want to show you this picture because this parade also shows the divisive role of race and the role of racism in the largely white-led suffrage movement. So Gardner and Alice Paul in particular did not want Black women to march along white women in this parade. Why? Because they feared that censoring the rights of Black women to vote would hinder their chances of getting a federal amendment through Congress. To get the federal amendment through Congress, you need 2/3 of the vote in Congress and then 3/4 of the states for ratification. So they knew they needed at least some Southern support. And in 1912, Southern Democrats took control of both houses of Congress and the White House for the very first time since the Civil War. So Alice Paul cold-shouldered and discriminated against many of the African-American women who wanted to march in the parade. Dozens of them did march in the parade, and they marched alongside their white colleagues, but this was not Alice Paul's plan. So I highlight this here as a way to show that from the very beginning, the role of race and racism really shapes the 19th Amendment's trajectory. And we can talk in the question and answer about these larger connections between the 19th and the 15th Amendment all throughout the 19th century as well. After the parade, Gardner and Alice Paul become bitter rivals. They worked together well during the parade, but Gardner soon comes to distrust Alice Paul because Alice Paul wants to protest, she wants to heckle the president, and she wants to campaign against all Democrats because Democrats are the party in power. To Gardner and her colleagues in Nassau, this makes no sense. Champ Clark, her next door neighbor, is a Democrat. Champ Clark supports the federal amendment. Why should Gardner campaign against him? Furthermore, Gardner and her colleagues in Nassau are older. They're more seasoned. They know that every couple of years, the party in power shifts. So why offend all the people that you're going to have to work with in 2 more years? So Gardner begins this long-standing rivalry with Alice Paul. And essentially what they're fighting over is who is going to be the lead negotiator in Washington? Who is going to be the voice of suffrage in the nation's capital? Now, Gardner ends up becoming Nassau's diplomatic corps. That's what her colleagues call her. And she becomes charged with securing congressional passage of the 19th Amendment and working with the Woodrow Wilson White House. She does this by reaching out to Wilson in 1916. She writes a very charming letter to his chief of staff, introducing herself and explaining that there are 2 suffrage groups. Alice Paul's group, the hecklers, HHG's group, not the hecklers. She includes a typewritten memo outlining these differences that later gets inserted into the congressional record to help congressmen figure out who is who. And then Gardner does something even more clever. She inserts a postscript saying, is there a time when Mrs. Wilson ever accepts callers? I would love to meet with her. The very next day, Gardner is at the White House having tea with Mrs. Wilson. And from that letter in the summer of 1916, Gardner is in the White House. She becomes a welcome daily presence at the Wilson White House. This is her and Nassau President Carrie Chapman Catt on the steps of the White House during one of their many visits. But I want to point out that even Carrie Chapman Catt did not go to the White House without going first through Gardner. Gardner is the one who convinces President Wilson to support the federal amendment. And she later boasts that she had asked him for 22 favors and he granted her 21 immediately and without question. So the real momentum for the 19th Amendment picks up after this, 1916, 1917. We can talk about the role of World War I in the questions. But you know what the biggest obstacle to congressional passage is? Race. You may have heard about earlier objections to women voting, like women aren't smart enough to vote. They lack the rational capacity to vote. If women vote, it will destroy the family. But no one is really saying that by 1917, 1918. Enough women had gone to college by then, enough women had careers, enough women were reform leaders that you couldn't rationally make those claims anymore. Instead, the biggest obstacle is racism. Gardner helps secure the vote in January 1918. That's the very first time that the House voted on the 19th Amendment and it passed. So the suffragists were really hopeful. They thought they'll have a smooth time in the Senate. They thought they would be enfranchised in time for the 1918 elections, not the 1920 elections, excuse me, but they were wrong. They were wrong and they totally underestimated Southern and Senate opposition along the lines of race. Why? Senators from both parties in all regions did not want to enfranchise Black women in the South, especially in states like Mississippi and South Carolina, where the Black population outnumbered the white. And senators feared that the 19th Amendment would somehow compel the federal government to enforce the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment on paper had enfranchised Black men since 1870 when it was ratified. But Southern states had flouted this through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation, and the federal government had not enforced this law since 1877. So the fear was that having 2 federal voting rights amendments would mean actual enforcement. And I just want to give you an example here of this, how this debate went. So Gardner, they know they need a couple more Southern votes. Gardner is friends with this guy, John Sharp Williams of Mississippi, who suffragists referred to as the most erudite man in the Senate. So they thought they might have a chance with him, right? Of any Southern senator, maybe he would change his mind. So Gardner writes him this charming letter reminding him how they celebrated her birthday together, how she wants him to redeem his state, make his grandchildren proud, on and on for 3 pages. He writes her back the very next day and says, you know, Helen, if anything could get me to do what you want, it's your letter. But I will never vote to enfranchise Black women in Mississippi. Why, he says? Well, first of all, Black women will go to the polls while white women will stay home. Second of all, he says, everyone knows that the real reason Black men in Mississippi don't vote, it's not because all the various legal things we've done to disenfranchise them, like poll taxes and literacy tests. That's not the real reason. The real reason Black men don't vote, he writes, as you can see at the bottom, is because they know if they do, some of them will get hurt. And he goes on to say, but because Black women are women, after all, we can't beat them up at the polls. We can't use these same violent intimidations. Therefore, he writes, I will never vote for this amendment. He said, if I live in any white state, I would vote for it, but not in Mississippi. And he was not alone in these sentiments. And it wasn't all Southerners, it wasn't all Democrats. William Borah of Idaho, who was a Republican, who was a suffrage supporter because women in Idaho had voted since the 1890s, he also refused to vote for the amendment because he was afraid that the nation would not enforce it, just like they had not enforced the 15th, and because he did not want to enfranchise Black women in the South. So what I want to emphasize here, and I hope we can discuss more in the Q&A, that the 19th Amendment got through Congress in June of 1919. This is HHG at the signing ceremony, which, by the way, she planned. It was the very first congressional legislative signing ceremony ever, and she arranged all the press coverage, and she even bought that fancy gold pen that the vice president is using to sign it. But the 19th Amendment only passes Congress, not because anybody thinks it's going to enfranchise Black women in the South, only because everyone knows it won't. Suffragists had signaled to the men in power that they wouldn't say a peep about the 15th Amendment. They wouldn't say a peep about enforcement. They wouldn't make a case for the rights of Black women in the South to be upheld. And that was the bargain that gets the 19th Amendment through Congress and eventually ratified. Gardner then becomes, as I mentioned, the highest ranking woman in federal government. And she spends her last 5 years worried about the legacy, the history of the suffrage movement. Who would be remembered? How would this story be told? Within days of congressional passage, she reaches out to the Smithsonian. She sends the Smithsonian this fancy gold pen and all the artifacts that the suffragists had at their DC headquarters. And she says, hey, Smithsonian, it's time to put together an exhibition about the women's suffrage movement, to tell our stories, to remember our names, to remember our faces. The Smithsonian puts together a very small exhibit called An Important Epic in History. This is not what Gardner had in mind. In her final speech delivered just a couple months before she died at this Nassau Looking Backward lunch, Gardner's speech was called Our Heroic Dead. And the speech was held not far from Arlington National Cemetery, which Gardner called the great city of the dead heroes of many wars. And she said, this is where our nation pays homage year after year to these soldiers for what they did to free their fellow men. But where were the brave soldiers of the women's rights movement, which she referred to as the greatest bloodless revolution? Where were these heroes commemorated? She wanted to know. Where were our Washington, she wrote, our Jefferson, our Hamilton? Where are they buried? And she said, our heroes are buried scattered over America in graves little recognized. That's where the great commanders of our bloodless revolution that freed womankind go. And she went on to say, these women were mighty, their courage, their patience, and loyal achievement deserve the Cross of Honor, the Distinguished Medal of Achievement, and the Hero's Wreath from all of us who should worship at their shrine and keep their memory green. She concluded this, her final speech, by imploring her audience to not forget and not allow our children to forget and our children's children to forget that we need to give our cheers for our living heroes, but also mingle our tears for our heroic dead. Having lived through the Civil War, its reconciliation, and its commemoration in countless statues and monuments, Gardner understood that how the nation remembered something is generally even more important than the thing itself. So I want to ask, how have we remembered this movement? And I want to end with this image, which is Gardner on her beloved white pony in front of the General Thomas statue in DC, one of the dozens of statues erected to Civil War generals that Gardner watched be constructed in her lifetime. And here, I think she's saying, where's my statue? You can see she's posing just like the general. And I think she's saying, where are the statues to women? How will our stories be told? How can our national narratives be modified to center the stories, the contributions, the experiences of women, and especially of women of color. So I hope that the 19th Amendment Centennial, Women's Equality Day, will prompt these discussions and prompt us to revise these narratives. Thank you.
Okay, now, yes.
Yes.
That was wonderful, a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I have to say, I know that Alice Paul is one of the feistier suffragettes.
Yes.
They're all feisty, of course. And so I'm kind of surprised that they were at odds with each other, but it sounds like Helen was a little more diplomatic in devising things, even though she was quite witty and feisty herself. So it's an interesting contrast. And we do have some audience questions, so let's start kind of back at the beginning. And the first question is, did the school's commissioner face any repercussions from the affair that got Alice fired?
Yes.
It was really got Helen fired.
Yes. So Commissioner Smart had also been appointed to the Ohio delegation that planned the Ohio contribution to the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia. So this was the first World's Fair held in America. And he was supposed to get like $1,000 stipend for having put together Ohio's contribution. But I think the reason their affair got outed when it did is that I think HHG went with him to Philadelphia. And this was like a bridge too far, right? To travel on the state of Ohio's dime with your mistress to the World's Fair. So he did not get his stipend for doing this. And then he was not renominated as school commissioner in 1878. But when you're a man of privilege, you have endless options, right? So he called up some of his friends and he got a new job in Detroit and became a leading insurance salesman. And so he didn't really suffer in the same sort of way.
Yeah, $1,000 is a real lot back then.
Yes.
And so another question is, how did she choose her name, Helen Hamilton Gardner? Was there any significance to that name?
Yes, awesome question. So I'm not so sure about the Helen part, but the Gardner and the Hamilton part, those were Charles Smart's grandmother's maiden names.
Okay.
Because Mrs. Charles Smart was already somebody else's name. And because she never actually married him, she wanted to signal her fidelity to him, her relationship with him. So Hamilton and Gardner were his maternal grandmother's last names.
And another question is, how would Helen react to realizing that in 2020, we had a woman running for vice president, but she was still facing a disproportionate level of criticism over having an affair?
Yes, exactly. I've been thinking and writing a lot about this. I have an essay coming out next week called The Sex Lives of Female Politicians, wherein I basically argue that, if the sexual double standard is alive and well, I think it's probably patriarchy's last best tool, and that women, and especially women politicians, are still held to this double standard, right? Where we tolerate, overlook, ignore all sorts of behavior among men. But for women, sort of we expect like a maternal grandmother who somehow we think is like beyond sex, or, just a mom in tennis shoes, the Patty Murray slogan, famous from 1992. But like real women, we can't grapple with. So I think that is a further evidence of the role of the sexual double standard. And I think that would really surprise HHG that it's so alive and well today. And I also wonder, why is Kamala Harris in the number 2 spot? Why is Kamala Harris not in the number 1 spot, I think is what HHG would say about that. Yeah.
And we have another question, and this is maybe for your role as a historian. Do you see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as more momentous than the 19th Amendment?
Yes, for sure.
Elaborate.
Yes.
Elaborate a little bit.
I think I would add, the Voting Rights Act of 65. The 1965 Voting Rights Act is what makes the 19th Amendment real. So in the 1920s and 1930s, if you study the enforcement cases a colleague of mine, Paula Monopoly, has a great book on this coming out called Constitutional Orphan. And you can see there that the suffrage groups, the main white-led suffrage groups, which League of Women Voters, what Nassau became, and the National Women's Party, they turn their attention elsewhere. They don't continue to fight for the 19th Amendment. They don't take up its enforcement. So it's not upheld in Southern states. And it's taken to be like thinly, what legal scholars will call like a thinly interpreted amendment rather than a thickly interpreted one. So for example, on questions of jury service, running for elective office, what does equality look like? What does it mean to be an equal citizen? So it's not interpreted in the ways that, for example, the 14th Amendment is interpreted as a larger range of equality legislation. So I think that, yes, those pieces of legislation are more important in many ways and what made the 19th Amendment real. Although we also then have to point out that Shelby v. Holder from 2013, really dismantles key provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So right. I think if you care about the 19th Amendment, which obviously you do because you've showed up at this event, the best way to commemorate the 19th Amendment and also the 150th anniversary of the 15th is to work for voting rights and voter access, especially right now today. Buy some stamps at the post office and make sure we have a post office so that we can all vote in 2020 and beyond.
And I have to throw in that I think that the 64 Civil Rights Act is excruciatingly important for the 15th Amendment.
Yes.
95 years later.
Yep.
And another question, we both have mentioned the League of Women Voters at the beginning of the session. And is that organization in a way carrying on the tradition started by women like Helen Hamilton Gardner?
Yes, I mean, you should answer this one, Stacey. I would say yes, and they're doing it so much better. Anti-racist activities that you all have, yes. Especially in terms of your redistricting efforts to end gerrymandering, all the work, not just voter education, but all the legal battles you all have been leading, especially in terms of felon disenfranchisement. Yes. Like a League of Women Voters is where it's at. Right. So if you like democracy, I say support the League of Women Voters. Right. Stacey?
Well, I like the sound of that.
What should we do?
Yeah, well, I started to say, and the League has actually started a diversity initiative before the recent upheaval in Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying it's before the Black Lives Matter actually began, that sure. group, because I'm not quite sure when they did start. And it might have been back in the St. Louis issue. I'm just not exactly sure, but yes, the League of Women Voters is on the forefront of protecting voter rights, and we're in court right now in Missouri trying to prevent the notarization requirement for doing a mail-in ballot. So during this time of COVID, yes, it's unfortunate. Okay, let's see. Did Helen ever consider running for public office? Was she ever urged to run?
That's a great question. She was not urged to run that I know of, but she was so excited about this Civil Service Commission post. So even before the 19th Amendment was ratified, Gardner starts writing and putting forward names of women to be appointed to high-level posts, because immediately she sees, like, it's one thing to have a vote, but we also really need a say in the government. So that's what she starts constantly, pestering Wilson and his staff about. And if you remember from my talk, I said she asked for 22 favors and got 21. So a lot of times people say, well, what one didn't she get? She had asked for Carrie Chapman Catt to be appointed to the Peace Commission negotiating the end of World War I. And she wrote this impassioned letter about, women have sacrificed everything and the reasons the war were fought were for democracy. Like, you have to have, give me a break, right? You have to have a woman on this negotiating committee. And Wilson wrote her back and said, no way. He said, as much as I would like to appoint a woman, the other countries wouldn't have it. So anyway, so she begins lobbying for women to have important posts. And the civil service one was like the plum of all the options, because it was the highest ranking, just underneath that of a cabinet position. So.
And when you were talking about her using God, what was her? Was she a Christian? Was she an atheist? She was an atheist.
She would say she was an agnostic. So
she's agnostic.
Her her debut was on the free thought lecture circuit, and the free thought movement it comprised of atheists and agnostics, and it was peak popularity in the US in the 1870s and 1880s. So Robert Ingersoll, her mentor, was known as the great agnostic, and he would draw crowds of 10,000 or more to his speeches. And I think the message really resonated after the Civil War, because there was so much death and sadness and depression and tragedy. And Ingersoll's catchphrase was, "The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. Mm-hmm. Be happy is to make others happy." So for sons, fathers, wives, widows, grieving the losses and wondering, like, am I going to be really reunited in the afterlife with everyone I know who died? I think it instilled some sort of hope, in living on earth. And it was really popular. So Gardner thought that her role would be to talk about what the Bible taught about women and what messages society and the legal system took from biblical interpretations of gender roles to restrict women's opportunities. And so that was her role in the free thought movement.
Well, she was quite a marketer also.
Yes.
Maybe before marketing was even a thing. And how did you come to discover her?
I first met HHG when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin, which my dissertation was about how 19th century women used science to advocate for equality. So she was one of my examples, because one of the big women's rights debates in the 1870s, 1880s was, can women go to college? And the leading male physicians, the leading male scientists said, no. And at first they said, women can't go to college because you can't have your period and go to college at the same time. And then they said, no, women can't go to college because their brains are naturally inferior.
Yeah.
So in 1887, just a couple years into her public career, Gardner reads about these theories, and she had tried to go to Columbia in New York and was barred from going to Columbia. And this was just before Barnard opened. So she takes on this leading neurologist in the pages of Popular Science Monthly, and she starts writing all these letters like, your theories make no sense. Like, this is not a blind study. You're comparing the brain of,
I love it.
Yeah. So she's so bold, and she has this back and forth. And then she starts trying to convince the women she knows, like Stanton, her best friend, to donate their brains to science, to prove that women are equal to men. So she gets Stanton to agree to donate her brain. But when Stanton dies in 1902, her children think that that is too crazy. They hate heathen Helen, as they call her, and they want to fulfill their mother's bequest. So when HHG dies, she has gone through all sorts. She consulted 2 lawyers. She lined up her doctor, and she made sure that her brain was donated to science. So her brain lives today in a jar outside the department at Cornell, which then had the world's leading brain collection. And the New York Times headline, after the study of her brain was published, the New York Times headline said, "Woman's brain not inferior to men's."
I think hers
That's how I first met her. Yeah.
Hers was probably even larger than most. And so we have another question. Do we have any statistics on how many women voted after the 19th Amendment was ratified? There was an election right after that.
Yes. So yes, there are a lot of statistics. Christina Welbrecht, a political scientist, who has written extensively about this, and she has a new book out tracing the woman's vote throughout the 20th century until today. So I would encourage you to check out those resources. So yes, women did vote in large numbers. And there's also really terrific research being done by another woman named Liette Gidlow about the ways in which African-American women in the South really pressed this issue of enfranchisement and enforcement of the 19th Amendment. So showing up at the polls, demanding to be heard, voting even though the local registrars refused to record them. And the thing that really is striking there is that after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Black women leaders went to the white-led suffrage groups. They went to Maud Wood Park at League of Women Voters. They went to Alice Paul at National Women's Party, and they said, hey, it's great. We worked together to get the 19th Amendment ratified, but Black women in the South still can't vote because the 19th Amendment is not being upheld. So can we work together to make sure the 19th Amendment is upheld? And the white leaders in all the white groups said, no, that's not our issue. We're moving on. We're moving on to the ERA. We're moving on to voter education. and that's a race issue. So I think that's an important legacy we really need to keep front and center as we talk about, who was enfranchised, which women are we talking about, what are we celebrating, and what are we still fighting for?
Yes, and as mentioned earlier, we do have an ERA event this Saturday morning.
Oh, yes.
I hope everybody tunes in for that.
Yes,
so
me too.
many people think the ERA passed. They just don't realize that it fell flat a little bit. So we're working on that still. Well, thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank everyone for the questions that they sent in. And do you have any final thoughts you'd like to impart on us?
I just want to thank everyone again for coming, for their participation. And again, I think the best takeaway message from the Suffrage Centennial and Women's Equality Day events is vote, 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 and do your best to ensure that our voting rights are upheld and that everyone has access to the ballot.
Well, thank you again, Katie. This was wonderful.
Thank you.